Good afternoon, everybody, or should I say good evening. First, I want to thank you for your perseverance, and we are so glad to have you as an audience for our session, which is called Moving Towards a More Needs-Oriented Global R&D Model for Global Health. In fact, this symposium is a bit a follow-up of last year's symposium, which was also dealing with the same issue, and in a way we are in the process of the follow-up of a long process how to promote R&D for diseases of poor populations. And I don't go through the whole history. Maybe I want to mention one landmark that was the Global Strategy and Plan of Action adopted after global intense negotiations in 2008. And this Global Plan of Action, I think it's still a very good plan. It had only one small problem. There was no funding for it. And because there was no funding for it, the issue of funding came up, and it took 2 working groups and quite an elaborate process to work on that. And we are not yet there. I mean, this funding issue is not yet solved. So I just want to very briefly update some of you who have not followed that process. Yeah, because the last major step that in that process was the report of the consultative expert working group, where the title tells you nothing, but it has been the working group that has prepared for WHO a report on innovative financing for R&D for neglected diseases. And this report is out since 2012. And one of the key basic underlying ideas were that we need a delinking of R&D costs and prices of products. There is a need for upfront public financing of R&D for these diseases, because this is diseases where there is a big need but not a big market. That has been also mentioned in other sessions. And we think that R&D is to be reestablished as a global public good. And that also requires a global response to these challenges. Yeah? And the last point, that this global action needs to be based on fair, transparent, and inclusive priority setting process. This now is just an overview of the core of this report, which has almost 100 pages. The summary is still 10 pages. Now this is only one slide. But there is, it's a bag with, let me say, relatively implementable ad hoc things that you can do, which are already taking place, like equitable licensing, milestone prices that can be used, patent pools. And then there are further reaching suggestions. And the last World Health Assembly, and that is where we are following up today, has again discussed this report and how far they can follow these recommendations. And I would say over time there has been a progress, because at this stage and in May, the Global Observatory has been approved by the World Health Assembly. We'll hear more about that. And let me say, the big whatever in the room going for a convention on global health, which would also basically, as we suggested in our report at the time, which suggested a kind of binding agreement on financing for R&D. This is still some way off, but we'll also briefly discuss, because whether that is still the way to go in the long term. Without further ado, I will now just mention to you the 2 things that have been discussed in the World Health Assembly. Among many others, the document is 3 pages. I just wanted to highlight what we discussed is here to establish a global R&D observatory, and we'll hear more about it, and then to implement R&D demonstration projects. And maybe, because there is still a discussion what is really meant by this R&D demonstration project, so we'll get some more insight into that. So we have a very distinguished group of presenters here, and here are the names. I won't introduce them now. We'll do that while we go through our session. I just want to introduce my co-chair. It's Professor Phil Fan. He's from the Carey Institute from Johns Hopkins University. He's an economist. He confessed to me just now. And in his short bio, it's not clearly spelled out, so I had to ask him. He has been working on many things which I can't mention, but among others also on technology transfer and of the role of pharma can play in the provision of access to essential medicines and also in the development of new drugs for poverty-related diseases. So without further ado, I hand over to my co-chair, and then we'll try to have a very brief summary at the end of this session, if there is some material to conclude. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Zhan. So I'd like to introduce the first speaker. Robert Terry is a senior strategic and project manager with over 20 years experience. He joined the WHO in 2007, where he led the development and implementation of the organization's strategy on research for health. He was at the Royal Society, where he ran the International Research Exchange Program, and the Wellcome Trust, where he was senior policy advisor. So, Robert.
Thank you. And so what I'm going to do is focus predominantly on the Global Observatory, but also just give some thoughts on the demonstration projects. We also have some of the other speakers will also be talking on them as well. So we will try and cover both of those. The advantage of speaking after Albrecht is that most of my first 3 slides have been covered. So this is the CEWG report, and as we've heard, the focus really is on how do we actually support R&D where the market is failing, predominantly for diseases in low and middle-income countries. And here are the main recommendations. And in a sense, a rewording, which is always a dangerous thing with a WHO report, but it's about finding market incentives. And I think this is certainly very interesting, having just sat through the previous workshop on antibiotic resistance. We're now at a place where it seems almost without resistance, the idea of putting public money into private enterprise in order to de-risk the costs of R&D is now becoming quite accepted. So I think that's very interesting, and obviously antibiotic resistance is something which affects us all. And so, but here the focus is really where there is no end market as such. And then as we've heard, we're looking at what are the available mechanisms out there, like the pooling of resources, the things that are needed to strengthen research capacity, and the desperate needs for coordination that are required. So this boiled down into a resolution, and as we've heard, it covered 4 main areas: an observatory, which would hopefully lead to improved coordination, discussions around financing, and some demonstration projects. So moving on, it's probably worth just trying to define what we think an observatory is. And I would say, a global observatory really these days would have to be something that's an online resource, but it would only work if it draws data from other sources. So it's not something that would be a top-down or essentially organized activity, other than being able to draw data and information from as many other sources as is possible. And what would it do? Well, it would monitor predominantly financial flows for global health R&D, but integrate that with other information, particularly around, say, the product pipeline and other outputs, which are metrics of research and innovation, such as patent information, such as publication information. Now, all of these have their pluses and minuses, but together they form a triangulation, a better picture, a better map, if you like, of what is going on. And I think it's true to say that right now at a global level, we really are very much in the dark as to who funds what, where, and how. And so to a certain extent, a lot of the conversations that have been happening the last 3 days here, I think would be greatly enriched if they had some of this data behind them. So what would it do if it existed and was able to operate like that? I think what we would be wanting to see is far better analysis at a global level of the R&D landscape and an overview. And essentially the real purpose, the real value of this is what it provides to national R&D portfolio managers, what it provides to donors, and does it change behavior? Would we be able to see a shift in behavior, a shift in financing from the current financial gaps towards these neglected areas? There are some other benefits that I would hope to see, which would be benchmarking. Benchmarking between countries seems to be one of the most powerful policy tools we have, and obviously an observatory would operate in an open and transparent way. And I think, again, that's very, very important for leading us towards coordination. But what are the challenges to this? Well, the biggest challenge, frankly, is very low capacity. In this paper, which came out in The Lancet a couple of weeks ago, which I was one of the authors on, only 37% of countries actually report any data on health R&D. And if we look at the low-income countries, most of the data that we have is an extrapolation or an estimation from neighboring countries. So we are in a situation of incredibly low capacity. And I think, again, that's a message that we've heard time and time again in the last few days. There is also a kaleidoscope of R&D classification systems out there, and there are no standards. So to a certain extent, we actually don't even have a method of comparing like with like. And even within a single agency, you will find this, different systems for recording R&D funding. There are varied methods and very varied quality approaches to setting research priorities, and there is absolutely no system for reporting research priorities, nothing that's, say, akin to the standards for reporting a clinical trial, for example. But at the heart of this, and I think the real question, which I don't really know the answer to, is how do we find the incentives? What are the incentives to countries to actually really engage and work with an observatory like this? I can put up what I think the intended benefits would be, but we need to work a lot harder to say that to design something would actually benefit countries, benefit donors. Because an example that is always in the back of my mind is that GFinder, which is an excellent survey of 31 diseases, is only supported by Gates. It's been supported for 5 years. They've just renewed it for 3 years. Lots and lots and lots of donor agencies and member states use that data. They like that data. They say they really want it, but only Gates funds it. So we have an example there of a real conundrum, a real difficulty. And finally, coordination. I think it's a well-known fact. A lot of people, they all love coordination, the idea of coordination, but nobody wants to be coordinated. So that remains a challenge. So one of the things that we're working on is there a simple system for actually classifying R&D, which is detailed enough to be useful, but not so detailed as to be a great burden. And so this is something that we first suggested in the WHO Strategy on Research for Health, which is a very simple framework of research by purpose. So is the research aiming to understand the size of the problem, the cause of the problem, the determinants, develop solutions, be they drugs or policy solutions, implement those solutions, and I think implementation research and operational research is now something that's really growing, and evaluation is the intended intervention having the impact we wanted. And you can apply this to many different areas, and you can get these types of results. This is just using research priorities that have been identified out of WHO publications. And I don't want you to really focus on the figures, but just to take away the fact that there is a very different picture. There's a different research portfolio between these diseases. And so when we look at this across the whole of WHO, and these are priorities, research priorities that have been extracted from WHO publications since 2005, what we find is that across the whole spectrum of the sort of research framework there is activity, but predominantly WHO is focusing on the areas of solution implementation and evaluation, which I think is where it should be. If we unpack solution, you can then start to look at whether or not we're talking about drugs or vaccines or vector control or medical devices. And I think, again, to a certain extent, one of the the difficulties for the CEWG was not really having access to this type of data when it was trying to write its report. So if we take those priorities and a selection of diseases, the types of diseases which the CEWG report was focused on, again, you can start to see by using a very simple method that there is a difference. There is a difference in the portfolio across here. And it at least informs our dialogue as to whether or not we've got research focusing on the right technologies, in the right areas, in the right degree. If we could put some financial figures behind that, then I think we'd be starting to get somewhere. But it's not all bad. I mean, we have to build on what is there. This is, again, taken from a Lancet paper. The references are in the slide, published a couple of weeks ago. And it really does show the link between wealth and research output. But the thing I draw most interest from this is not that there's a direct correlation, but because you've got outliers and differences between countries, and it's not a direct correlation. And to me, that suggests there is policy and decisions that are being taken between those countries, which means there are different outcomes. So there is learning there. There is things that we can learn on. Why is it that certain countries seem to be able to outperform where they should, dependent on their GDP status? So again, this is the type of thing which an observatory should be able to bring light to. Again, some more examples using clinical trials, using publication output, and again, we see the same broad correlation between those research outputs and GDP, but we do see outliers, and it's not 100%, certainly nowhere near 100% correlation between those two things. So there's space in there, there's gaps, there's ideas to learn on. There are other initiatives which are coming online. This is a very, very simple schematic that is produced by NIH and 8 other funders, which just shows where they are funding in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, it gives a slightly false picture because these Google Maps always look like everything's covered. It's only about 60 or so different projects there. But even with this type of data, you can start to see clustering. So therefore, you can start to make decisions. Should we be working closer together in the areas where we're already working, or should we be seeking to work in those areas where we're not working? And again, this type of work will start to enable better dialogue and better conversation to happen, because it's only through that which we will lead towards coordination. So the final slide on the observatory then is it needs to be developed in a phased approach. It can't be done overnight, and it has to be done in a phased approach. Build on what is there. We definitely need to work with the established networks and work in a networked approach. Building capacity within member states is important because that's really where the absence lies. I don't know how to make it sustainable. I think the output will need to be open and freely available, but that actually works against sustainability. And there's a lot of work around norms and standards and research classification. So in summary, that's where we are with the observatory. I just beg my indulgence just for, you said about the demonstration slides, projects, I've just added a couple of slides on that. I think we are interested in the ideals, and the ideals are very, I think, very difficult to perhaps meet in every single project. And it is around different ways of funding. How do we explore the open research methodology that's now available to us, particularly with the internet? It's so much easier now. We can share data and information at marginal costs. And so how do we actually use open innovation? How do we use those sorts of things? Obviously, delinkage is a key element, and it's how do we actually take out the cost of the risk of undertaking R&D. Creating new partnerships, and again, I think a predominant theme throughout this day has been antibiotic resistance. And if there is a silver lining to that particular cloud, it is the way that it's pushing through the creation of new partnerships. So I think Sadie's going to cover more on some questions on the demonstration project. In terms of next steps, there are regional meetings happening right now, and they are focused towards identifying up to 4 projects for each region, which will then go forward to a meeting in Geneva at WHO HQ on the 3rd and the 4th. A group of experts will be looking at those projects and trying to whittle them down to a manageable number, possibly around 6 or so, and then after that, that recommendation will go to the World Health Assembly. So I think that's all I really want to say on the demonstration projects. I will leave you with the necessary linkages between all of these efforts. And I think that's the most important thing. Again, it's really systems thinking and health systems approaches which we have to work. An observatory on its own only really works if it has some impact or feeds data into a global mechanism. There is a role here, perhaps again for WHO, with expert panels taking that data, and then we have a better chance, perhaps, of making some sensible decisions around financing.
Thank you very much, Robert. So the next speaker is Sadie Rajmi. As Robert says, Sadie will be talking about some demonstration projects. Sadie was the co-author on the Lancet paper that Robert was mentioning in his talk. Sadie is currently reading medicine at the University of Manchester, and she's a junior research fellow at the Institute for Science, Ethics and Innovation. One of her areas of interest is how to incentivize innovation in alternative ways.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. So, as was mentioned, I'm just briefly going to mention UAM, which is an organization I'm affiliated with. And it's a student group with about 70 branches worldwide, and we work on trying to implement socially responsible licensing policies at universities. So just last week, University College London joined 5 other UK universities in accepting a socially responsible licensing policy. And we've been talking a lot about interdisciplinary collaborations, and I just also wanted to mention that the Institute for Science, Ethics and Innovation, where I work, is an interdisciplinary institute. And in 2009, as a result of 2 meetings chaired by Nobel laureates John Sulston and Joseph Stiglitz, the Manchester Manifesto was published, so it examines questions relating to ownership of science. So just briefly to touch on the conceptual foundations of intellectual property, because it helps me to think about what kind of mechanisms of incentives is optimal for society. I'm just going to quote Linda Cohen and Roger Knoll's paper to illustrate the point that we have intellectual property rights because, for utilitarian reasons rather than because we believe them to be a natural right. So I quote, "Unfettered IP rights enable rights holders to monopolize any market that their market power permits for as long as they want, and to deny any use of intellectual property that does not enhance their income, even if permitting such use would not diminish the value of their right. In principle, Isaac Newton's heirs could collect royalties every time someone used calculus or the formulas of classical mechanics. Or, if they had been converted to an anti-modern religious cult, Newton's heirs could deny everyone in the world access to any technology that made use of their ideas." And the pictures there are just to illustrate 2 more examples. So the heirs of Alexander Graham Bell or Thomas Edison could each insist that anyone who wants to use electricity or telephones must live in a house that's owned by their company. And in such a world, all must choose between telephones and light bulbs. Now, few of us would agree with such an unfettered use of intellectual property rights. And public policy on intellectual property rights is not based on the moral rights of the creators, but on the assumption that they maximize health outcomes overall. So if we can agree with this assumption that essentially we must have intellectual property rights for utilitarian reasons, then we must make sure that intellectual property rights incentivize the right kind of innovation, and they do so better than any other system of incentives. So just to look at neglected tropical diseases, these are diseases for which the intellectual property rights model of incentivizing innovation hasn't worked. And despite the fact that 1 in 6 people in the world suffer from neglected tropical diseases, they have not traditionally received R&D investment. So although the concept of NTDs is thought to have been around since the 1970s, I think it was coined by Ken Warren, the term has only recently been revived since about 2005. And as use of the term has grown in recent years, its success in collecting together a group of diseases and using their combined burden to give the whole group added moral, political, and economic weight has been significant. So as we can see from the graph there, R&D funding for these diseases has increased significantly in recent years. But if we look a little bit more closely, we can see that overall funding has not funding increase has not been shared equitably among the diseases. So although over there we can see that dengue has disproportionately benefited, whereas the kinetoplastids have actually, the funding has actually decreased. So with regards to an observatory, I think we should just be careful about what we actually monitor, because if funding is not further disaggregated, then some diseases may end up losing out. This graph shows the DALI burden of the diseases, of 12 of the NTDs, I think, and the 2007 and the 2011 funding that went into them. And again, we can see that dengue has received quite a lot of funding increase, and hookworm infection that has a very large DALI has received a relatively little increase. And I'm not suggesting that just because hookworm has the highest DALI burden, our R&D efforts should focus on hookworm. NTDs used to be divided into tool-ready and tool-deficient diseases, and it might be entirely appropriate that dengue, which needs a lot of new tools, gets more funding, despite the relatively small DALI burden. But my point merely is that funding allocation is not currently done on any objective measure. We have an ad hoc approach to R&D for these diseases, and it's not aligned on need. So I would argue that this illustrates the need for more coordination for R&D funding allocation, and I would also argue that as more players enter the field of R&D funding, as we've noticed in recent years, coordination is all the more important. So I'm just going to end with a few questions. To jump slightly to the demonstration projects, the PAHO region received 29 submissions, which we can see on the left, for funding for demonstration projects. And I think it's interesting that so many of those are for cancer. So the yellow ones at the top are all for cancer. And it's also interesting to see who's applied for funding, I suppose. But the Brazilians and Cubans seem to be taking the lead. And my understanding is that each region is only supposed to have about 4 demonstration projects overall. So I don't know what sort of measures we're going to be using to decide which of these 29 gets precedence, if there is a criteria at all. So I have opinions on that, but I don't have any answers, and I hope we can discuss some of these questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachmi. So our next speaker is Dr. B.T. Slingsby. Dr. Slingsby is CEO of the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund. Before he joined the fund, he was involved in a number of profit and non-for-profit entities in the US and in Japan, and was responsible for global access strategies for Eisai Company Limited. Dr. Slingsby graduated from Brown University, where he earned his master's and doctorate from Kyoto and the University of Tokyo. He received his MD from George Washington University. Dr. Slingsby.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to a discussion amongst the panelists. Today, I'm actually arrived here from Japan, and today I would like to introduce to you our fund, which is basically it's a public-private partnership set up in Japan to facilitate R&D for malaria, TB, and what was just went over in terms of neglected tropical diseases. So it fits within the scope of the conversation today at the observatory, just one aspect or one portion of those diseases that are covered or are being considered to be covered for the observatory. And I didn't really want to go over too much in terms of the content of our fund and kind of the sales pitch and whatnot, but actually provide a concrete example of how R&D is conducted in terms of using these public-private partnerships, so that we have some type of context and some type of concrete example possibly discussed later in the afternoon. So allow me to skip a few slides. So our fund basically does grant making, and through that grant making, we facilitate R&D, try to form partnerships. All of our partnerships are for actual product development. So if you take the R and D, it's just merely D. We're there not to facilitate capacity building, not try to facilitate or to fund new technology platforms, new animal models. We're there to actually advance product development. We do that through grants and then managing of those partnerships and that grant portfolio on a milestones based. So we just don't give the money, it's very product development milestones based funding. So I wanted to go over one example of what we will be funding. This is a historical example of one type of such partnership. Now to date, similar organizations as ourselves, we actually have a partner, one of our partners is the Gates Foundation. They've led much of this talk, as well as the Wellcome Trust, DFID, the US government, through a collection of organizations called the Product Development Partnerships, the PDPs. And through those nonprofit organizations that advance R&D for NTDs and malaria, TB, and HIV, they've actually developed 18 new products to date in about 10 years. So this is quite an impressive record. If you take the accomplishments of a big pharma or whatnot, it takes them usually in terms of looking at risk, looking at time, looking at investment and resources. It's good if they get about 3 or 4 products out over the 15 or 10 years. So I wanted to give you one example of a product that was developed through this kind of public-private partnership. And this is type of the project that could possibly be a project with the observatory down the road. And that is with the Afric vaccine. Previously, the meningitis A strand in Africa did not have a vaccine. There is a counterpart vaccine for the strain that was common in the developed world. But that vaccine was $100 per vial, one, very unaffordable, and number two, it didn't prevent meningitis A throughout the meningeal belt throughout Africa. So the problem was that there needed to be an effective product made, a vaccine, and that it needed to be affordable. And what that meant is basically under $1. So how this was taken out was through a partnership framework. The Gates Foundation funded PATH, which is one of those product development partnerships, along with the WHO. They set up the meningitis vaccine project based in France. And then the meningitis vaccine project worked with private industry, both in these two companies. One is Ariel and one is Cinco. And they're both based in Europe, and they're both biotech companies. So it's not the public sector that actually developed it. It's actually the private sector that developed it, but it was public funding. The FDA also provided tech transfer, and then they found a vaccine producer in India that actually produced this vaccine for under $1. Now, with that product, over 50 million people have been vaccinated. If you just take one outbreak over the 10 years, because it usually occurred every between 7 and 10 years, over 400,000 cases of meningitis have been prevented, saving about over 40,000 lives and averting over 100,000 sequelae. So this is really impact. It shows that how partners and how partnership can facilitate R&D and kind of advanced R&D for a product that doesn't have a market incentive. And so the fund that I currently work for, the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund, is precisely trying to do what this partnership did, and that is create a vaccine as a public good that can actually help eliminate the neglected tropical diseases or malaria or tuberculosis and participate in that fight going forward. So hopefully we'll be able to speak more about this and this concrete example in the coming hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Slingsby. So our next speaker is Dr. Katharina Burmey. Dr. Burmey is the CEO of the Foundation for for innovative new diagnostics. This foundation is located in Geneva, and its mission is to develop and implement fit-for-purpose diagnostic tests to fight infectious diseases. FIND coordinates the evaluation of products and platforms for the diagnosis of poverty-related diseases. And it does this through the coordination of field trials as well as the use of its laboratory facilities to enhance access to these tests.
Thank you very much for the introduction. As Dr. Fan said, FIND is one of the globally around 25 existing product development partnerships that work to discover, develop, and deliver new tools across different modalities, vaccines, medical devices, medicines, and diagnostics, to address disease areas where market forces are weak and where new tools are not being developed because of these weak market forces. This is really an updated slide, I think, of what Dr. Slingsby showed. And so over the last 10 years, these PDPs delivered about 39 products in these different areas, vaccine, diagnostics, and medicines. But almost more importantly, or as importantly, PDPs have created an enabling infrastructure and a partnership model that we can build on today to further accelerate innovation and product development in the area of neglected diseases. There is wide consensus among PDPs that they can be part of the solution, but cannot be the solution to foster R&D and to help fight neglected diseases. But I believe that the PDP model of conducting and managing research and development has aspects that can be applied more widely in global R&D and a lot of lessons that can be learned for a global R&D framework, especially in the area of how PDPs manage IP, manage open access, negotiate pricing with manufacturers and industry, and try to accelerate and coordinate the path to regulatory, to registration, product registration, and thus market access. There's a wide consensus among PDPs also about the need for a more sustainable solution, new incentives, and a more sustainable finance mechanism in the field of poverty-related diseases. And thus, several of the PDPs have been involved in the submission of demonstration projects, and I'll just present one of those here. Just a quick word on FIND. FIND in many ways is a typical product development partnerships in what we do. We work with more than 200 partners to develop diagnostics. We work across several disease areas, including TB, malaria, and several of the neglected diseases. And really, we have no wet labs, for example, but what FIND does is we coordinate R&D. We're ISO certified for project coordination, and we leverage the investment of various donors against product affordability and royalty-free access. So a lot of the aspects in that are in the CEWG report are sort of part of our business model. We delink R&D cost and the cost of a manufacturing infrastructure that is heavy usually in diagnostics from the test price. We make sure that that the IP is non-exclusive and that technology transfer can happen to local countries. And lastly, we are focusing more and more on in-country capacity building because we've learned that the diagnostics we have delivered are unfortunately not being taken up rapidly enough due to generally weak health and laboratory systems. So we focus on lab system strengthening. And we also increasingly focus on capacity building in R&D to work with countries to strengthen local manufacturing of products. This is just to say again that no one can do it alone. We work with more than 200 partners, and so do many other PDPs in this area. And we believe that this is really a crucial criteria for success. FINE's achievement have only happened with the support of these partners. And I'm just going to give you two quick examples. One of the technologies we worked on was Expert MTB-RIF, which really is widely seen as the most revolutionizing tool in TB diagnosis. As you can see here, it has been developed with a relatively large number of partners, US-based, but also country-based, and also was funded by a variety of donors. I think when you look at the development of Expert, you can actually find a lot of lessons to be learned that could be applied to a global R&D observatory. Among others, that really the development started with the development of product specification that ensured throughout the development process that the development was focused on patient needs. Pricing was key of the agreement from the start, and there was a coordination around a decreased price at several steps in development and after the completion of development. And then the clinical pathway for this new tool was completed in just 20 months with an enrollment of over 10,000 patients, together with national TB control programs in 6 countries. Expert TB MTB-RIF today is shown to be taken up in 95 countries and is really changing the global management of TB drug resistance. But also it has shown us what we can do better going forward. It has helped countries to identify health system weaknesses, and it has shown the R&D world how we can possibly deliver better TB diagnostics going forward. A different example is the development of a new rapid test for sleeping sickness. That happened again with a large variety of partners, among others a manufacturer based in Korea and an R&D partner based in Brussels, and clinical trial sites based in a variety of countries. So again, shows just that it is possible to develop new tools in a consortium. It is not always easy, but it has happened in this case. And this new rapid test that really looks like a pregnancy test for sleeping sickness is being rolled out in African countries as we speak to fight sleeping sickness. There are just 4 key lessons that I want to bring up here because I think they are important, again, to consider for such a global observatory. One is really the importance of target product profiles. We didn't pay enough attention to this in the early years at FIND, and we've learned our lessons painfully, I think. So this is just to say that in product development, the target product profiles need to go far beyond just accuracy of a test, but really need to address affordability, but also supply chain, service and support issues, etc. Learn to fail fast. Really what I think many PDPs have learned the hard way is that you can save a lot of money if you're brave in the beginning and terminate projects early. I think that's an important lesson in general for R&D because most of the costs are actually in late development and during the clinical evaluation. And so I think a coordinated approach also to terminating projects would actually be very beneficial and could prevent the waste of a lot of resources. Further streamlining the clinical pathway to WHO endorsement. WHO endorsement remains key to public sector uptake across a variety of diseases. For TB, for example, this pathway is very heavy with an enrollment of at least 6,000 patients per new TB diagnostic, for example. But this is true also for medicines and vaccines. Regulatory harmonization is important, but really also making sure not only in countries, but also the way to WHO, make sure that it's standardized and that it's manageable for industry in partnership with trials or with trial sites and centers of excellence. This is just to show that an important part of what FIND does is really managing clinical trials. That's our global trial site network, composed of more than 60 trial sites and specimen banks for each of the disease areas we work on. That has turned out to be a crucial asset for R&D, for the discovery for new biomarkers in each of the disease areas we work on, to make sure that, we enable the development of new tools and pass this knowledge on to industry.
1 minute.
And largely, yeah. And last, my last slide, I think, is also the need to accelerate and broaden access. So as I said, comprehensive upfront contract negotiations with the developer, with industry, are key in our opinion to ensure affordability, but also the quality. I think we need to pay even more attention to establishing strong quality assurance systems, because the tools we develop are often not used in the way we want them to be used, and we need to establish stronger post-market surveillance tools that help us monitor the uptake and quality of these tools in the field. I think I'll skip I'm going back actually. Yeah, this is just one example that could be used as a basis for discussion during the open discussion, and it's one project that has been submitted by MSF and DNDi that I find quite powerful as a proposed demonstration project, because it cuts through different areas, diagnostics and medicines, and thus shows sort of the importance of a joint intervention to be successful. And I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Doctor. The next speaker we have is Andrew Jakk. Andrew works for the Financial Times in the healthcare and medicines beat. His list of awards is actually too long to get through, but I'll mention a few. He's won the American Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene Reporting Award in 2011. He won the 2013 Media Award of the European Organization for Rare Diseases, first prize in the Stop TB Award for Excellence in Reporting in 2010. He graduated from St. Catherine's College in Cambridge and was the Joseph Hodges Coet Memorial Fellow at Harvard University. Mr. Jakk.
Thanks, great introduction. Well done for sticking around this afternoon for so long. I'll try not to speak very long, and no slides or anything like that. I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, so I don't go for elaborate PowerPoints. And that said, as a journalist, I'm impatient. You know, I work in very short-term deadlines of hours, or these days increasingly of minutes. So sometimes it's a challenge writing about R&D, which of course can take years or even decades to move from initial basic science through to products, drugs, diagnostics, devices, and so on that make a difference in this field to people's lives. You know, when I look at the title of this, moving towards a more needs-oriented global R&D model for global health, I'm also a little impatient, let me be a little controversial, with processes, with institutions, dare I say it, with conferences. I'm interested in initiatives, in action, in other words, moving away from models and conceptual frameworks and high-level debate to actually things that make a difference. And I think, you know, sometimes we get a little bit too obsessed with the sort of high-level intellectual discussions rather than looking at and focusing on the areas that could make the greatest difference most quickly. A lot of respect for Albrecht and for Robert, TDR, and a lot of the effort that they and a lot of the other panelists here are making. But dare I say it, CEWG, I mean, I've followed its evolution and its three predecessors, I think, over the past decade or more, meet and talk and spend an awful lot of money and frankly get nowhere, or very near nowhere. And we all can identify a lot of these high-level problems, but it's time to move to actually going somewhere. Politics, of course, data, high-level visions and concepts are very important, but really, they also have their limits. And if the last subclause of what we're discussing today is, are the World Health Assembly actions likely to solve the financing access gaps? I would say no. I think clearly high-level processes have been very important. The Tobacco Convention, the Framework Tobacco Convention, undoubtedly played a very significant role in smoking control, which clearly has been one of the more fundamental and exciting and positive developments in public health over the past few years, though I think we could debate cause and effect, because of course a lot of other things were also happening at the same time. But my fear on a lot of these processes is whenever you fail to build a global political consensus, whenever conclusions don't come up with the things that certain interest groups want, we end up scrapping and starting again rather than actually pushing forward pragmatically with what makes a difference. We have heard some great examples here, whether it's the Japan Fund, whether FIND on diagnostics. We heard from several of the speakers about a lot of these individual initiatives that we've seen in diagnostic techniques, in new vaccines, Afric Vaccine, for example, and other areas in the last few years. Those are good and they're practical. We've seen in the industry sector, which we haven't seen represented here, but I spend quite a lot of time observing, also a lot more coming forward and taking initiatives, whether it's in donation programs or it's in, fundamental R&D, because after all, we wouldn't be where we are with ACTs for malaria, with ARVs for HIV, for even new TB drugs that are being just launched on the market, and a couple of other products in late-stage development at the moment, without the industry contribution. We've also seen a lot more debate around these hybrid models and partnerships and around the idea of open cooperation, both in terms of clinical data and the opening up of compound libraries to third-party researchers. So I would make a bit of a plea for partnership rather than exclusion with industry as part of it. I'm a big critic in many ways of what industry does. I think we've also got to be realistic that clearly, of course, their primary drive is going to be for profit. They have to deliver medicines in order to return high-risk capital to their investors. And so neglected diseases are never going to be right at the center of their focus. But I think there are ways to antagonize and exclude, and there are ways to include in a way that can add their expertise in an important way. And I think there's a great opportunity that we've seen in the last few years, even arguing, as it were, along strategic commercial lines in the self-interest of the pharma industry, partly because pragmatically, as established markets like the US are stagnating and the growth is coming in the emerging markets, where, of course, there's a very different disease mix, and partly where, with the rising costs of R&D, there's an increasing realization of the need to work in partnership and try and reduce waste, that you're seeing collaborations not only with non-profit groups and governments, but also amongst companies themselves, once intense rivals. So you see common platforms for genetic variations in cancer in Asia, for example. You've seen groups around diabetes working together. In HIV, for example, partnerships between different companies, both for R&D and for combination products. So more kind of IP legal post-launch combinations to improve formulation and eventually access. But I think, so in conclusion, I'd stress a couple of things. First of all, I think we can talk a lot about the idea of, as CEWG does, for instance, about removing or downgrading intellectual property. We can talk about the idea of decoupling of R&D from incentives. But I think clearly, pragmatically, if industry is to be involved, and indeed others, I'm just not talking about the pharma industry, but all the different players in health and global health, then there have to be incentives in place. And someone was alluding earlier to the antimicrobial resistance discussion, which is, I think there's one of those going on next door as well. The industry is not very active. It's not simply about money or IP. It's about terribly difficult science in the case of course, antimicrobial developments. But it's also, again, about a lack of incentives. And there's a perfect extreme example where there is a market for new generation antibiotics. But of course, if those drugs are going to last any amount of time, they have to be rationed very tightly. And I've seen a number of drug companies developing products, but I haven't seen much yet of a response from individual countries. You know, let's put the question of a global treaty on R&D to one side, and let's say, why don't we see, you know, the UK, France, Sweden, and the US, let's say, between them saying, here is a pot of money of a significant number of hundreds of millions of dollars that it would have to be to guarantee purchases of this next generation of antimicrobials. And in exchange, we as payers will develop a stewardship plan to ensure that those drugs are not wasted and used too widely and in turn trigger resistance rapidly. But to me, I'm still hearing in that domain, as in neglected diseases and a lot of these other areas, a lot more talk about high-level discussion about global initiatives, and much less, let's actually go forward and do some of these demonstration projects. So I'd love to see, you know, some of this stuff come out of the WHO process. But my word of caution around it would be, you know, the more political, the more difficult it is to have a rational selection process around which products, which diseases, which drugs will be funded in the next stage through the pipeline. And I think that probably that process needs to be miniaturized, as it were, away from the global towards some bold individual countries and funders that will take the initiative, and it needs to be depoliticized to focus on areas of greatest scientific promise and impact. And just a final plea, we're talking about R&D. Of course, but we shouldn't just be focusing about pharmaceuticals or diagnostics. I think if we want the greatest impact on public health, we need to think about operational research, we need to think about prevention and behavior change, we need to think about the balance between direct medical interventions and broader issues around infrastructure, sanitation, and economic development as the drivers of a lot of the big health gains during the last century. And so if we focus too tightly, we risk spending an awful lot of money for actually relatively little potential benefit. And in the same way, if that's a plea to kind of diversify beyond R&D in health products, as it were, I'd also say we need to bring in industry and other players in broader areas than simply in R&D, which is to say a lot of what I see in developing countries particularly that fails is not the supply of innovative new medicines, it's the physical distribution and supply chain full stop for the most basic goods and services. It's about a lack of interest and attention and innovation in the less sexy back office functions of forecasting, of procurement, of delivery of integrated health packages. And I think some of those are some of the broader issues that I'd like to see discussed today and over the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I want to thank all the speakers for their really excellent presentation, and I think all of you who have stayed now for this session are really rewarded by these really in-depth and very substantial presentations. I have one question, a bit taking from the last speaker. In a way, you have been questioning, probably rightly, let me say this, as you probably see it, over-focus on global frameworks and global processes and so on. On the other hand, we have most of the argument is for more investment and also for global solidarity in that respect, is that there is the argument basically there is a global international responsibility based in human rights approaches, in different approaches. And if you want a global responses, you need a kind of global framework. So it looks a bit to me like a deadlock, yeah. But maybe we can have a bit of a feedback from the other speakers and how to balance, basically, yeah. Or is are PDPs a kind of a middle way, you know? No? Yeah.
I don't disagree with anything that Andrew said, actually, but I would perhaps let's just remind ourselves why we got where we are. And to a certain extent, the CEWG was, in the end, given quite a specific task and a very focused task, which was to very much look at product development. So in a sense, whilst we can criticize them, I think we can't really say, you know, where is operational research, where is these other elements, because they were, in the end, given that very kind of focus. But that's not to say that this is everything. There is, I mean, certainly just with what WHO does, which I'll admit is usually fairly small, you know, there is quite a lot of work done on trying to strengthen health systems. There's a whole department on, say, medicines pricing and delivery and forecasting and avoiding stockouts and all of those kind of things, which are happening elsewhere. And I think, to a certain extent, whilst I also made the plea for a sort of systems approach, and earlier in the day and yesterday, you know, we had lots of focus on, say, the social determinants of health. So I don't think those things are excluded from this, but there does come a point at which you have to focus and deliver, and I would say the PDPs are an excellent example of that. And perhaps it may even be too early to sort of judge them rightly or wrongly. So I accept a lot of what you say, but I would say, you know, where we are with the CEWG, like many, I don't think we're going to have a magic answer come out of the World Health Assembly. But for many, many years, there's been quite a lot of requests that there needs to be more political attention in this area. So here it is, we have it. You know, it's a double-edged sword. It's very unwieldy, it's very bureaucratic. But I think we have to try to make the best of the opportunity as and when it rises. So I think that's probably enough. Let's see what other people want to say.
Do you want to say something? Yeah, because you have a great example.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to talk about my example, but I just wanted to reinforce that I do think that such a global R&D framework would be very useful. But of course, there is the worry of that approach not being pragmatic enough, of a high level of bureaucracy, and also of the danger that we would lose speed in the process. So I think it's going to be important to balance that. But I do think it could be a way to actually increase ownership also of countries to enhance local R&D capacity and ensure local production. I think many countries such as Brazil, China, India, for example, do have local manufacturers now and have the money to invest more in R&D in neglected diseases. So I think the global R&D framework could be a tool to enhance ownership in this area of such countries.
Are there any questions from the audience or any points you'd like to make? Please use the microphone. And if you could introduce yourself, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Frank Ries. I'm writing for the German magazine African South, which is more surely than on African issues. What I want to hear in this discussion was so far that last time I heard, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, something about the American priority review voucher for especially drugs on neglected diseases. This was seen as a very good method at this time, maybe to give some incentives to research in neglected diseases. Was there any outcome on this? That would be my question, because to be honest, I also had to say I'm a realist with Mr. Jakk. I don't see so much new things here.
So I believe your question was in regards to the priority review voucher by the FDA, is that correct? I don't know if it has any relationship with the CEWG, but the priority review voucher is per se a pull mechanism. as an incentive for pharmaceutical companies and other organizations to do research in that area. The review voucher covers diseases like TB and malaria, all the NTDs, for drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, not for vector control. It's been used twice. When it was used previously, it was you still have to pay a fee to use it. So you still have to pay the submission fee of about $1 million to use it, and doesn't necessarily on the drug that you do use it on. It doesn't necessarily get approved. But it is I believe it's a very valid pull mechanism, and it can be hopefully used more and more in the future. It doesn't exist in Europe, nor in Japan. So I do believe it's slightly an innovative approach for one of the types of pull mechanisms that is out there. In terms of the observatory and our fund as well, we're much more of a push mechanism in which we're providing funding and trying to advance partnerships to push them to do such R&D. So there you have the pull and push.
Any other questions? So actually,
Sorry, I have an answer to that one. I think it was negatively reviewed by the CEWG, the priority review vouchers. So I think they do look at it, but they don't, in the report, it's just not favorably. The priority review vouchers have been analysed by the CEWG, but not favourably reviewed. So they don't think it's a good idea. It probably wouldn't work. But I think the push and pull factors are really interesting, because even when we talk about a pool, creation of a pool, what do we want that to be? What do we want the pool funds to be? Do we want it to be mostly pool, or do we want it to be a grants-based system? Both have positives and negatives, so I think it's interesting.
Maybe I can add a small comment. We have discussed that in the CEWG at length, pros and cons. I mean, there is a whole 2 pages on that. Yeah, these priority vouchers are basically, that was another argument. The money comes at the end of the day from the sick people in the countries where these priority vouchers are implemented and where the drugs are sold. Yeah, so it's basically, I mean, we also looked into where is if you create this mechanism, who is at the end of the day paying the bill? Yeah, and that is usually basically the users of these drugs from that company. Yeah, because they will basically other drugs will come later and they will be more expensive. Yeah, so there is no real overall benefit. Yeah.
So I have a question for the panel. There were a couple of mentions of Big Pharma. Big Pharma is withdrawing major efforts in things like psychiatric drug development, which to me is actually increasing not only in developed countries, but also developing countries. What I would like to hear from the panel actually is their experience and what they think about engaging Big Pharma in things like the PDP, especially in the area of knowledge sharing, which is not something traditionally, they're set up to do.
Do I think Big Pharma should be involved? Yes. Are they getting more involved in knowledge sharing to some degree? Some of it willingly, some of it less willingly. Obviously, there's been a big discussion around clinical trial transparency and the potential for data mining to look at real-world evidence and to look at unexpected signals and to re-examine and look at the potential for repurposing older medicines for different uses once that body of data is public. I think that provides tremendous opportunity. Cynically, you might also say that the restructuring, which has caused a lot of cutbacks and dismissals of scientists from Big Pharma, does have one minor benefit, an unintended consequence, which is that there are a lot more people with drug development skills, as it were, out there who hopefully would see the opportunity, you might already have actually made enough money themselves, have that skill set of drug development, which is very specific, and would be willing and able, as some of them do, to join, for example, product development partnerships, or because talking about barriers is not just about, in my view, breaking down the barriers, the cultural barriers within Big Pharma, it's also breaking down the barriers in those other institutions with which they need to work. And, you know, for example, academia, universities, very often, when I've talked to people, university technology transfer departments put up higher barriers and have more greedy, unrealistic expectations about royalties on early stage, on patents, essentially, you know, in early stage in vitro science, way before it gets towards drug testing in humans, that actually make it very difficult to develop those things into affordable products. And in the same way, the culture of reward in academia, which, you know, essentially says you've got to be a professor, you've got to publish, you know, that's the be-all and the end-all. The number of discussions I've had with groups like that who don't actually, dare I say it, individual scientists who aren't even always motivated or interested in the sort of the end point. You know, they're more interested in those sort of the rewards that come with a peer-reviewed prestigious publication than in, for example, writing an op-ed in a newspaper that might have a much broader impact, or the ability to create hybrid structures, university-type institutions that develop drugs in partnership. You know, I think some other institutions are better able to integrate people from different career structures. I think academia has traditionally been very conservative, certainly in Europe, about bringing in people from outside and working with them. So I think there's challenges on all sides, but yeah, I think Big Pharma certainly needs to be part of that equation.
In terms of product development partnerships, Big Pharma it's absolutely necessary and absolutely essential. It's very difficult for a university or academia, or even academia and public institutions such as NIH to develop a drug. There's a lot more than just experiments in clinical trials. You have the entire process, the back process of chemistry, of formulation, of manufacturing, of regulatory science. And there's very few stakeholders outside of pharma that are expertise, and they're expert in that. So if you look at the many drugs and the vaccines and diagnostics that have been developed through this network of product development partnerships, it's in one way or another in partnership with a pharmaceutical company. In terms of the question for psychiatric disorders and psychiatric medications, that comes down to market principles. It comes down to the return on profit for the company. And I think the question should only focus on the role of pharma, but the role of pricing and the role of how prices are set for pharmaceutical products in each country. Because it seems apparent that compared to oncology, or compared to cardiovascular disorders, that psychiatric disorders and the products that align the shelves for psychiatrists are priced very lower, and that their profit margins are thus lower as well.
Yeah, I still have a question. I mean, routinely one would have expected that, at least from some of you, there is a call that we need more resources. I didn't hear that. Because you thought it's self-evident, or because, especially as far as the PDPs are concerned, funding is at the just now no problem, and because you mentioned that the problem is sustainability, which is another aspect. But is there, from your perspective, a kind of funding crisis, or are the problems not just, at least now, not in the first place funding, but in other areas which you have outlined?
Well, if I have a start, I think, I mean, the first part to answering that question is, well, we can have some guesses about what the funding requirements are, but we don't actually know. So, I mean, that, comes back to what I was talking about. I do think there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system. And, I could say this very much as, say, coming from, a big donor like Wellcome Trust. The barriers between funders working together are still very significant, be they government or be they private philanthropies and what have you. So there is quite a lot of inefficiency in the system. And dare I say it, we do now have, 21 PDPs who presumably have a number of shared activities which may be better done collectively as opposed to, separately, like fundraising and comms and all these other kind of things. So having said that, I do think there needs to be some shifting of the funding. And in fact, even with just, if you look at the data produced by GFinder, there is some shifts that could quite easily happen even within the pockets of money that we currently have. And there are areas that receive significantly less funding than perhaps they should do. My difficulty is, in the same way that we're now having to, say, question the roles of big pharma and whether or not we should still remain profit-driven for healthcare, I think we also have to challenge the public sector for perhaps its reliance or over-reliance on a kind of perhaps begging or charitable approach to everything. Everything requires just more money, and then everything will be fine. And if I can say this, seeing as my ADG has left the room, I would say there is a pretty good argument to say that the big pharma has probably moved more in the last 10 or 15 years to accommodate the significant public pressure for them to be active in this space. And I think initiatives like, say, Malaria Box, where, giving out drug compounds. I think the Trescantos laboratory, funded by GSK, establishes a charity and working in a very open innovation approach. Things like that. I think the involvement of the industry with PDPs, you could make a case that there's been far more innovation, to use that word, from the private sector than maybe within the public sector itself. And certainly I would echo Andrew's experience about very sort of land-grabbing tech transfer officers within universities, sometimes very unrealistic expectation on putting patents on things. So the public sector has quite a lot to learn, I'd say, from the private sector, dare I say it.
If I could just reinforce the point that Terry made on the imbalance of funding. I think DNDi and MSF will publish a paper in the Lancet Global Health on Thursday that shows that still most of the funding is directed to few disease areas. And in a lot of neglected diseases, there's very little funding for R&D. But even in disease areas such as TB, I don't think we'll get to the tools we need with the money available now. So I do definitely think there is a need for more money. And I don't think we'll see the success or we'll reach WHO targets, for example, for TB, without new funding mechanisms and additional funding.
Okay, so
Sorry. I just think there's a huge case to be made for middle-income countries pulling their weight as well. I don't have I'm a huge fan of graphs. I don't have it right here with me, but Brazil, India don't contribute nearly as much as they should, and I don't think the case has really been made for a new research and development framework for why high-income countries should adopt it. When we talk about things like AMR, there really is a case to be made for more kind of coordination globally.
Maybe there is still a question from the audience.
Thank you. There's time for one more question. Would anybody, please, could you use the microphone and introduce yourself? Thank you.
I'm Chris Dye from WHO. This is a discussion about needs-oriented R&D, and what seems to be missing from this discussion is an articulation of need from the populations that are affected by these neglected tropical diseases. There isn't anyone on the panel today. And the question I have for the panel is it just missing from the panel today, or is it missing from the debate in general? How good are the countries and populations affected at articulating their need? Because a number of the products that we see, Katerina talked about Gene Expert, for example, for diagnosing TB. I mean, that's a repurposed product that was really designed for something else. It's not a product that was designed to serve a stated need. And if you talk to people in country, the countries most affected, about what's needed for tuberculosis diagnostics, it's something out at point of care that could be easily operationally used and so forth. So my question is, to what extent is that articulated need missing from the communities affected?
I mean, perhaps by way of summing up as well. I mean, I think it is a very good point, and to me that's actually, the starting point. I mean, that's where I just feel impatient with these high-level processes. Let's start with what matters. And as you say, I mean, yes, we do need to hear the voice of the patients, the diseases, and of course the neglected ones tend to be those most excluded in every way politically, in terms of sympathy, in terms of access by broader communities and so on. And I think that brings me to that sort of wider set of debates. I suppose, why, and it comes back to your point at the start, Albrecht, but, why, I mean, for example, HIV, why did that work? And of course, it worked because of the advocacy, of the urgency, of the universality of the message, and, a new, very frightening, fast rising global infectious disease and products to at least start to bring it under control. Going back to the high-level political debate, the other parallel which I cited was the Tobacco Convention. And coming back to your point, Robert, I mean, it just seems to me that, without that, what's changed? If we talk in high-level, abstract terms about R&D needs and so on, we don't focus on the, or at least until we get the kind of the perfect data sets, which never seem to arrive, we're still not there in terms of defining in a crystallized way the priorities. And I think the political debate, it's the World Health Assembly to me is just the wrong group, if you're talking about your issues of rights-based approach and so on. I mean, the reality is, these are health ministers. The people we talk to are the finance ministers, and they're not coming to Geneva to the World Health Assembly. And the health ministers are generally not terribly well empowered within national governments. So I just don't see, I see just a big mismatch between the huge amount of advocacy and effort that goes into these sort of slightly abstract, high-level, worthy principles versus what needs to be done on the ground, which is why, yes, let's see India or Nigeria, two actually quite rich governments make a decent commitment to public health or to pilot funding of some of the, the demonstration projects that you've been working on. And let's start with the tangible, the difference that makes to individuals and the new models that work, rather than, spend another 5 years talking about the high-level data and the principles and the rights and so on.
Okay. Very nice summing up, actually, Andrew. I'm glad we have you here. I would encourage all of us to continue looking for local examples. I'm reminded of this hospital called the Aravind Eye Institute in India. They have innovated incredibly up and down the value chain to correct preventable and correctable blindness. Completely local effort. And I think together with PDPs, local funding, local entrepreneurs, local businesses, big pharma, I think there are many examples that are out there. I don't think the situation is as dire as it appears, but certainly the voice of the user, the voice of the disease victims really need to be heard a lot more clearly. So with that, I want to thank Professor Albrecht Jan for organizing this incredible panel. I was just saying to him, it's a heck of a panel, actually. And I want to thank the panelists for coming and presenting, and for you for staying.
Yeah.
Professor Jan.
Yeah, also thanks for this great panel and for you to stay on. Originally, we thought we might produce a kind of ad hoc summary, but I can't compete with the excellent summary that Andre has already given. I mean, I think also for me it was really, I mean, I have been in that process, but there is also for me a take-home message, and one is probably to focus, I mean, I think some global regulation and some global framework will be needed, and probably we need also to continue that, even if these global processes are cumbersome and, you know, but I mean, it's better to have long and cumbersome discussions than basically to fight each other, yeah? So I think that is, you know, that is in a way the nature also of this process, because you have so different interests to cope with, yeah. But I think also looking at the other side, and not get lost in these global debates without looking what is going on the ground. That links a bit to this other aspect, which has been also mentioned from the audience. One of the big problems to me is still how to identify needs, yeah. Because even now, if you, I mean, you can still argue why is a disease included in the neglected diseases and not another. I mean, and if we have common diseases like diarrhea and pneumonia, where also there is very little investment. So the whole process is not really rational, and it's true there is a dilemma. I see that the more you go up from local, country, national, regional, and so on, the more, let me say, you are away from the ground, and the more you are also away from the priorities on the ground. So to some degree, probably these processes and also the priority setting needs to be decentralized and be closer to the situation where the problem really is. Yeah, I mean that is. I think we have to bring in also this other side of the coin, so to speak. Yeah. Again, also to thank all of you and all of you again. The debate will continue. We did not solve it this evening, unfortunately, so we will have more things to debate here, next year, or somewhere else. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.